Welcome to SAM Conversation, a program of South Asia Monitor. Today, we'll be discussing the centenary of the Chinese People's Communist Party and South Asia. And will one see a more assertive China? It is my pleasure to welcome Major General Govind Dwivedi, retired. It's a pleasure to have him here. We know each other from the National Defense Academy. He was commissioned about 5 weeks earlier than scheduled in the Indian Military Academy. And with a very short break at home, they were pitched into the 1971 India-Pakistan War. He reported on the 1st of December in the Eastern Sector, erstwhile East Pakistan. Thereafter, he commanded his battalion 16 Jat in the Siachen Glacier. Then he commanded a brigade and a mountain division in the northeast. And lastly, most important, he was a defense attaché at Beijing. He also spent a lot of his time teaching, apart from writing and being part of strategic discussions. Professor Kondapalli Srikanth is a professor in Chinese studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies and many other Chinese institutes. He is what I often refer to as India's very important strategic intellectual weapon in our intellectual arsenal. Joydeep Shoikia is, apart from being a specialist in security studies and terrorist affairs, he has taken part in 2 Sino-Indian Track 2 dialogues in China as well as in India. He is presently located at Guwahati. Pleasure to have all of you here. Now, 13 days ago, on 1st July, Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the Committee of the CPC, was wearing not his usual black suit or dark suit. He was wearing a Mao Zedong suit, gray color, specially tailored with the old collar, button collar, and he addressed in a grand ceremony. He addressed about a gathering of 70,000 or so at the famous Tiananmen Square, where he extolled upon one of China's greatest achievements of building a modest, prosperous society. And also historic resolution of eradicating the problem of absolute poverty. And there were 3,000 students of various age groups who sang several songs composed in wartime. This is the Communist Party of China, which began with a strength of 50 and now are reported to be the largest political party in the world with 95 million. there's a great museum that has been built for this centenary. The Chinese People's Communist Party centenary. Now, it's a very Chinese are great at projecting themselves, photographs of very impressive looking large columns of the army, infantry, armor, artillery. And as far as that museum is concerned, it also covers the extreme misery for many millions of people whose countries China occupied. In a very short, China has disputes with 18 countries, 10 with land disputes and 8 with maritime disputes. India, Nepal, Bhutan, Laos, Mongolia, Myanmar, Tibet, and Cambodia are the ones with land disputes. In this case, Mongolia and Tibet have been totally occupied by China. The maritime disputes are with Taiwan, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Japan, South Korea, and North Korea. And on occasion, it is reported to have also laid claims on North Korea. Finally, it has entered and caused a debt trap in Sri Lanka, Pakistan in a very big way, Malaysia, Maldives, Philippines, Indonesia, and Tajikistan. There's so much more which scholars present with us will be kind enough to educate us with. Major Govind Dwivedi, I request you to take the lead, please.
Thank you, Anil. Firstly, my pleasure to be on your show and also with the panelist. I know Sri Kondapalli from very long time. So let me start. Firstly, you have not indicated as to where to start, so I exercise my choice and go back to your 13 days, what you narrated. Let me take a little peek historically. While Chinese history dates back to 5 millennium, but China was unified sometime around 221 before current era, and since then there are 13 dynasties which have ruled China, and only 8 had the honor to complete a centenary, and therefore Communist Party of China joins the 8 elite league to have completed 100 years. So therefore, they have something to celebrate upon. And secondly, again historically, in Chinese culture and tradition, the mandate to rule always comes from heaven, and this was legislated by King Wen of Zhou dynasty in 1021 BCE and further reinforced by Confucius. Here again, the Chinese Communist Party claimed the mandate has come from heaven. And this again is a point for this celebration. Now, as you are going to go along the discussion, I'll just flag only few issues as a starter. That Chinese Communist Party, has lot of achievements to credit and also a mixed legacy because through their number of initiatives, a lot of suffering has come to the Chinese people. And there were three very important landmarks which we'll discuss as we go by. And they had three paramount leaders: Mao Zedong, who is the architect of China's, or the what we call People's Republic of China, which came into being in 1st October 1949. And thereafter, the second paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, and now, of course, Xi Jinping. All the three have a very different chapter in the Chinese history. I'll just only spend two lines on each, and then let the other panelists take it on. Well, as far as Mao Zedong is concerned, his philosophy was that it is the masses which will make the difference and take the Chinese nation to the old is legacy as being the number one nation of the world. And therefore, he exploited the Chinese masses and went on to initiate some major movements like Great Leap Forward, where he thought that Chinese could industrialize just on sheer willpower. Then Cultural Revolution, where he wanted the elitism and corruption to be wiped out. And this was on till he died in 1976. Now, Deng Xiaoping wrote a different chapter altogether. He dumped Mao's ideology and he went on to initiate very path-breaking reforms, Kaiga and Kaiform. And his philosophy was that we need to change the narrative. Communism and poverty are not synonymous. So he initiated the reforms, and because of that, social market economy took off, and that was the start point from where China began to emerge as a global player. And he did two things. He legislated that the tenure of the future incumbent should be only two terms, that is 10 years, because he had to come to power through a past struggle. And there two who followed him, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, basically, I can call them stopgaps. They carried forward the reforms and they stuck to the two tenures. But it is Xi Jinping who has changed the narrative. He came to power in 2012. He again has done a couple of very path-breaking things. Firstly, he done away with Deng Xiaoping's ideology of hide and bite, and he made it very clear that China has to emerge as a global player. Secondly, he has started a different route to the global top table, that is through the Belt Road Initiative and also through geoeconomics, which you mentioned very briefly. And that is his way of taking China forward. And what he's using is debt trap diplomacy or checkbook diplomacy. And he has also done away with the two-term presidency. He has put himself on the top for the lifelong president. And he has convinced the Chinese people that they require a leader of continuity, of strength in next 10 to 15 years. So that's where Xi Jinping has pitted himself, and centenary celebration were to actually convince the people that he is the Mao in making, he is the second Mao, and he is the one who is going to make China great, and they must invest in him, and they must ensure that he is re-elected next year, and he has taken upon himself as the sole person riding the dragon and taking China into the new era. Anil.
Thank you, Govind. That was a very well brought out account by you. Professor Srikanth Konapalli, I request you to take on from here.
Thank you very much for hosting me this evening. I think one of the things we need to remember when we deal with China is there is a lot of propaganda, and they make a certain make-believe world in suggesting that they are always legitimate, they are always above board or on other counts. Let me slightly dissect the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party. They said that by 2021, they will establish a well-off society. And well-off society is supposed to be something like European standards at around $25,000 to $30,000 per capita. However, today China is $10,000 per capita. If you divide $14 trillion GDP into 1.47 billion people, that's how we get. However, in the speech that President Xi Jinping made in the centenary celebrations, he mentioned that the extreme poverty has been eradicated. This leaves a basic question: how come you have poverty in a socialist society for 70 years? Secondly, even if you believe the extreme poverty has been resolved, and this is basically propaganda that China is conducting, even if you believe extreme poverty, this is only 20,000 rupees definition for the poverty, extreme poverty. So that is, when you compare the $10,000, this is a major problematic. Let us leave that poverty elevation because this is one the Chinese have been propagating. Second is, of course, they are the second largest economy today since 2010 with $14 trillion GDP. With this, they have also several outreach programs like the Belt and Road Initiative, as you mentioned, a community of common destiny, which we do not know what exactly is this, but I think it is forming alliances and friends in the international system, because currently they have only one military ally in North Korea and an all-weather iron brother in Pakistan. The rest of the world is not configured. So they're looking for partnerships in this format of community of common destiny. Secondly, there's the President Xi Jinping's centenary speech mentioned about the national rejuvenation. We do not know what exactly national rejuvenation means, but it is basically domestic rebalancing, and they wish to become the superpower in many areas, as the 14th five-year plan suggested. What does it mean for South Asia? I think in 4 or 5 areas. One is the territorial dispute they resolved with Nepal, with Myanmar, with Pakistan and Afghanistan. There are several provisions in these which they are now reviving. For example, Article 6 of the 1963 agreement between China-Pakistan, whereby Pakistan sacrificed the Kashmiri land to the Chinese in Sakshkam Valley, Ruksam, Agil, Shimshal. In all these areas now, China is putting up its CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So some of these territorial things are being revived. For example, also in Nepal, they are claiming the whole of Mount Everest, although in 1960 agreement, they considered the south of Mount Everest as part of Nepal. But today there is a move to gobble up the whole of Mount Everest. In addition, of course, they are claiming several areas in the border areas with Nepal. Recently, we have seen many villages have been taken away by the Chinese. So they have had also the territorial dispute resolution with Afghanistan. But with the Taliban increasing its role, we probably will see a number of developments unfolding in the border areas in Badakhshan and Xinjiang province. Additionally, we also see that India and Bhutan have not resolved the territorial disputes with China. And here is the problem where we witnessed the Doklam and Galwan Valley incidents where 20 Indian soldiers have to sacrifice their lives. Second is the Belt and Road Initiative that you alluded to. And here they are investing heavily in many South Asian countries, except in India. In India, their total investment is $8.2 billion, while in other countries, $62 billion proposed in Pakistan, already invested $42 billion, 54 in Bangladesh, something like $50 billion in Sri Lanka. That is the kind of profile that they have for Belt and Road Initiative, which basically means that the Communist Party wants to also set up bases in these South Asian countries, and that is where the assertiveness will come in the near future. They have had free trade areas with Pakistan, with Sri Lanka in negotiation process. In Maldives, they rushed through in the parliament when the previous president was ruling. Of course, that will be taken care of by the current government. There is also a huge arms transfer from China to South Asian countries, specifically to Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And that is a major concern for India, specifically in nuclear and ballistic missile technologies. Third is that they are now positioning themselves into SAARC plus China, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation for China. But this has been in low priority at the moment in India. And so China has propped up the Himalayan Quad, and 3 meetings have already taken place between the foreign ministers of China and select South Asian countries. Finally, I would suggest the terrorism portion, where China is going to assert substantially. One, against India in protecting Pakistan on Zakirul Rahman or Hafiz Saeed in the 1267 committee, or in terms of the next moves in Afghanistan when the Taliban takes over. Remember, China had trained the Mujahideen, and China is currently in touch with the Hekmatyar group among the Taliban. So this is where I think the issue of China's assertiveness is also reflected.
Thank you, Dr. Kodapalli Shrikant. And I'm so glad you brought out in very clear terms the kind of support that China has been giving to terrorism. Because the fact remains that the Pakistan is a very convenient ally in in its relationship, in its anti-India relationship, and they don't have to do a lot because Pakistan is doing it for them, at least in the valley. And in the northeast, they did their bit of inciting the India's northeastern insurgents. Those insurgents were converted to terrorists in the late 90s. Jaydeep, I request you now to take on, please.
Thank you, sir. Professor Kondapalli, and you have already mentioned about the regional assertiveness as far as the concerned countries in South Asia are concerned. Although, having gone through the speech, General Secretary's speech doesn't directly mention that assertiveness aspect which you have asked us to discuss today. Instead, he has directly talked about, without naming the United States, not being lectured or bullied by the United States. And he talked about, of course, one China aspect as far as Taiwan is concerned. But if you read between the lines, the aspect which is very clear is what you just ended by saying. You said it helped the Northeast insurgents at one point of time. I would say in recent years, we have witnessed a re-entry of the Chinese into the Northeast insurgency game or terrorist game. I'll just cite a few instances before I get on with the other aspects. For a fact, the Alpha is now a divided house, as you are aware. The Alpha Independent and its chief of staff, that is the leader, paramount leader of the Alpha, Paresh Barua, is sitting in China, in Yunnan, in Ruli. And actually, it is making a mockery out of the unilateral ceasefire, which it had announced because of citing COVID. But the fact of the matter is, it is totally under the control and command of its Chinese masters, perhaps the Ministry of State Security, the intelligence branch of the Chinese PLA. And as also with the other groups, like the Manipuri groups, the valley-based insurgent groups, General Dwivedi has, since he has commanded 57 Mountain Div, he will know that, there is something now called the Coordination Committee, which comprises the mighty groups which are known as the valley-based insurgent groups. And the most interesting thing is at this point of time, when you talk about regional assertion, is to also understand as to how they're perhaps because of their concern about India being a part of the Quad, which also is perhaps they think is led by the United States for the interest in the region. They are also trying to sort of contain and circle India by arming, as Professor Kondapalli says, the neighbors of India primarily. I mean, there's no reason why two submarines, Dil class submarine, perhaps Ming class submarines, were given to Bangladesh. Happens to be a friend and an ally of India, and of course to Sri Lanka. And um, as we were talking bilaterally, sir, the fact of the matter is now the Indian insurgent groups are being used by the Myanmarese army at the behest of the Chinese against his own population, even as there is an unrest against the military takeover of 1st February 2021. But if you look at the speech in itself, you will not see any talk of regional assertiveness. Instead, if there's anything, there was talk of cooperation and concord and peace. So this aspect which General Dwivedi also spoke about, and Professor Kondapalli spoke about propaganda, is paramount in the entire gamut of the centenary celebration, which was unveiled on the 1st of July this year. I'll come in a little later with other aspects of this.
Thank you, Jaideep. In fact, it is worth mentioning here that the National Socialist Council of Nagaland, which is often in recent years referred to as the National Socialist Council of Nagalim. Nagalim means Nagas, areas in the northeast inhabited by Nagas. If that's what they're trying for in the garb of these peace talks, it is a very, very, very dangerous and a very bloody aim. I say bloody because it can cause very, very, serious riots. The NSCN, IM, Isaac and Muiwa, Twingling Muiwa's nephew, Anthony Shimre, was a very major go-between for the NSCM and China in dealing with many issues, particularly the supply of arms to the NSCN, to the ULFA, United Liberation Front of Ahom, and the Maitai groups, as well as to the left-wing extremists. So it's that deep a relationship. General Dwivedi, we now, we want to, see whether there is any timing to what happened last year. After all, the world knew, and I mean that this China will be, celebrating its 100 years of the communism, or the rise of the Communist Party in 2021. And what happened was last year was a second Chinese aggression, which I'm sure was very well planned and planned quite a bit in advance. Apart from many other things that you'll bring out, I request you to throw some light on this, because this timing factor is one which is rankling a lot.
Anil, I think you offered a very important dimension. What happened last year was very well planned and well calibrated operation. It had two very important dimensions. One was the aim, that is military and political aim. There was a absolute synchronization. And second was the time. And in fact, I have written a lot on this because I had the advantage of commanding my battalion in Siachen and in Chishul, and also served with special forces in Pegongso and Depsan and Galwan sector, and wrote a book on 62 war. So I had done a lot of writing on this. And for the benefit of your viewers, I'll just like to flag a couple of important issues. Firstly, we have to see this in larger perspective, that South Asia is the backyard of China. And Chinese, strategy has been how to have a favorable and a passive South Asia. And they are invested in all the countries. Pakistan, of course, they are the Himalayan, trans-Himalayan corridors in Nepal. Bangladesh, there's enough investment of BRI, Myanmar. I won't touch into that. But India comes into the center of the South Asia because that's the only adversary the China faces in Asia beside, uh, I would say, Japan. Now, why you said timing? Timing was very critical for number two, three reasons. First and foremost, Xi Jinping wanted to have some brownie points for the centenary and also for next year's 20th Party Congress. And it is a stated fact in the Chinese white paper that sovereignty implies integration of all the claimed areas into the mainland. And that includes Taiwan, that includes South China Sea, and Chinese have claim on South Tibet, that is Arunachal Pradesh. So therefore, he wanted to make some quick gains, and simultaneously, he also went to South China Sea. He did a lot of, I think, the cohesive actions, a lot of confrontationist actions through the Navy, and also you have been seeing that against Taiwan, there have been off and on intrusions into the airspace. So one aim was to have quick gains and also to build up the image of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party of China. Secondly, I think Xi Jinping had decided that in his time, he would like to sort out the India-Pakistan issue. So he wanted to actually almost come to the 1959 claim line, and that way the incursions also took place in those contested areas, in Pegongso area, in Galwan area and Depsang, where they have the claims. So quick gains and almost then sort out the line of actual control into some kind of border. And thirdly, he didn't want to have a fight. He came in, PLA came in all the areas which are unheld but contested. So therefore, it was a high return and low cost option, occupy the areas and make quick gains. Politically, he wanted to cut the Indian leadership to size and show the world that China can take on any aggressive preemptive actions and limit our leadership to only reactive issues. And also at the same time, I think he had a very direct interface with our prime minister, and he wanted to sort of also give a strong message that if you don't look after Chinese interest and cozy up too much to the West, then China will take it in a very negative manner. So, if I put in a nutshell, the last year aggression was well planned. It had very clear political and military aim, and it had a very clear tactical execution plan wherein they went in such spots which are unheld and did make very quick gains. But at the same time, I'll just like to add few lines that how did India react and how did India ensure that Xi Jinping does not fully attain his aim. Firstly, we reacted very strongly, and these are the areas, as I said, Kailash range and all, we have done a lot of soldiering. So we occupied a very important point, and it put the Chinese onto the defensive. In fact, Chinese were really rattled when we occupied the Kailash range, and also we reacted very strongly, almost 50,000 troops we have right now. And Xi Jinping has got a very clear message that it won't be an easy run against India. And if he tries to scale up or up the ante, there will be serious repercussions. Anil.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, very well, very relevantly brought out by you. In fact, I think it's worth mentioning that on the, in 1967, it was proved that China the PLA got a shock. And the Indian Army was pleasantly surprised. There were skirmishes in Nathula and Chola, in which they were very, very aggressive initially. They graduated from small arms to artillery fire. And when the Nathula Brigade Commander requested for artillery, it got sanctioned a few days later by no less than the Prime Minister, then Mrs. Indira Gandhi, who was holding the defense portfolio also. And the kind of retaliation that we gave them, it amounted to almost short of 400 PLA soldiers being killed. That was a rude shock. And it also got proved very, simply to the Indian Army soldiers that this Chinese soldier is no Superman at all. One Gurkha rifleman of 711 Gurkha Rifles made a quick job of reducing 5 of them. I won't speak in stronger terms. Decapacitating 5 of them with their heads off. Thereafter, they pressed hard that let's not fire at each other. They became very bullet shy. And we had to, learn the art and science of bulletless border management. Till last year, when in 1975, October, they killed 4 Assam Rifles riflemen, not by bullets, but by torture. On 5 and 9 May last year, 2020, they attacked Indian soldiers with medieval barbaric weapons. Again, not firearms. On 15th at Galwan, they attacked again with these crude weapons and killed Colonel Babu and 19 other ranks of 16 Bihar. That got such a reaction by the personnel of 16 Bihar and the neighboring units that they went with, again, without firearms, and the kind of fierceness with which they attacked the Chinese soldiers. The official count is 43 or 45. The unofficial count is 100 or more. That sent a second very rude shock to the Chinese and put paid to, I think, Xi Jinping's plans of any further, aggressive moves. Shrikant, would you?
Yes, indeed. I think it is interesting to see the mobilization by China, both in 1962 border clashes, when we had seen the First World War kind of mobilization in 2 different theaters by China, in Eastern as well as Western. But when we came to the Nathula Chola incident in 67, it was a terrible problem for the Chinese PLA because the casualty rate mounted on their part. Tulungla incident in 1975, we of course lost the Assam Rifles, 4 of the soldiers. And then we had the Doklam and the Galwan incident last year. These suggest that China is unwilling to resolve the territorial dispute with India. And despite the protocols that we have signed with them regularly in 93, 96, 2005, 2013, and others, they were not willing to resolve the territorial dispute. It's only on their terms and in a revisionist manner, that is the southern Tibet, as they call Arunachal Pradesh, that be given to them, or on the 219 highway. Beyond that, their claims have now gone. Also, they want Chumar, which was never disputed before. So in other words, they are now raising some irredentist claims And this is one key problem for us in maintaining stability on the border areas. Nevertheless, what has happened is, as you rightly mentioned, as against the 20 Indian soldiers killed, the Indian side during those days, first, second days after the skirmish, on June 16th, 17th, there are reports suggesting that 120 Chinese soldiers were killed, while the TASS news agency of Russia mentioned 45 Chinese soldiers killed, and China admitted only after 8 months that only 4 of their soldiers were killed. And they never declared the 1962 casualties. According to our estimates, 700 soldiers were killed in 62 on the Chinese side, but they never admitted these. Likewise, they never admitted to the Korean War casualties in 1950, nor of the Vietnamese War casualties. The Vietnamese suggest 45,000 Chinese were killed in that war, but they never gave these figures so far. So, which suggests that the way they treat their soldiers is something that the international community need to ponder over. When we compare, say, Colonel Santosh Babu or others who have been killed in the June 15th incident, you know, the bodies have been taken to the villages, and there is a standing ovation from all the people in the neighborhood. So there is a problem with how the Communist Party treats its soldiers, those who passed away in combat duties. So this is a difference between the Indian side and the Chinese side. Definitely, I do agree that there is a problem in their accounting processes. Second is in terms of the situation in Western sector. It is said that any invader requires something like 8:1 strength in the Western sector because of the mountainous terrain. Currently, they have 60,000 troops as against our estimated 1 lakh troops. And this suggests that they will not be able to successfully conduct any operation in the Western sector because of the 8:1 requirement in the mountainous warfare. So structurally, they got stuck, and we are now facing this armed stalemate in the Western sector.
Thank you, Shrikant. See, it's whatever has happened now, we stand at a stage where they've only left the Kailash range, and they made us leave Kailash range, and they've left the Galwan area opposite that. What is what we need to see is with this concept of supremacy, and we are the the ultimate in the world. And what are Xi Jinping's plans for the second millennium, the second century that is to come?
Yes, indeed. They have laid down in the 19th Party Congress about 2050 scenarios. They said that they will realize socialist modernization. But actually, the key phrase in the 19th Party Congress is they want to occupy the center stage, which translated roughly is to acquire global hegemony. So they also assess that the United States is in relative decline. And so they want to fit into the shoes of the United States in terms of global hegemony. What it means for India is they are striving to be #1 in Asia. In many parameters they are, but striving to be #1 in Asia, which means displacing the Indian leverages in different parts of Asia, especially Southeast Asia and South Asia. And so this would be also problematic for us. And this is where we need to strive for at least a concert of Europe with Japan, with Singapore, with other like-minded countries, Vietnam, Indonesia. Secondly, we also need to further the Quad quadrilateral security dialogue process in order to balance China?
Thank you. Thank you. Jaideep, would you like to, um, take a look at again you being in Guwahati, the northeast region? We haven't, had any major incidents to, but I'm very, very sure that they couldn't be sitting tight. With I'm referring now to the in view of this centenary future plans for India's northeast.
Yes, sir. I think it would be worthwhile also, if I am allowed to do so, to also understand as to why Galwan happened. If I were to take you back to 1962 for a minute and say that perhaps there is a thought process, there is a thought thinking that it happened because of the then perceived failure of Deng Xiaoping and the failure of the Great Leap Forward itself, and the need for a digression. And that is why, and of course, it very conveniently coincided with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So 1962 aggression happened. If you were to superimpose 62 to last year, to the 20, people were saying that, a similar kind of a ploy was probably in Xi Jinping's mind when there was a diversionary sort of a tactics, because unlike what most people feel here, my analysis tells me that the CPC might not be a monolithic, entity, and there could be fissures inside the, in the party. As a matter of fact, in his February 2021 speech, I think Xi Jinping himself said that the breach in the fortress would come from within the fortress. That is the way it can be translated in another way. Professor Kondapalli is here. But he says basically that there are basically factionalism within the party. And to 2020, when China was reeling from the Wuhan virus, of course, emanated from China, Wuhan itself. And so basically there was a need to divert the attention and, create a problem for India, territorially so. But as you were talking about the Northeast, yes, things are very quiet, despite the fact that, one expected that the eastern sector, there would also be an opening up of the eastern sector, like the way we have seen in 1962 and later on in, as he says, in Turungla, in Sumrongchu also. Nothing really happened, but I think they are playing a very astute game by sort of, using proxy in the Northeast, and not coming directly for a hot war posture like, manner this time around. But it's very important to understand that if you, just to play the devil's advocate for 1 minute, if I were to sort of analyze and say that if you were to look at between the lines, it seemed, despite the fact that Xi Jinping cautioned the United States that they would not be lectured and bullied by, foreign powers, etc. They talked about the one China theory. They also left a little bit of room, saying that, and they did not use the word India or, any other South Asian power, but they said that, we believe in peaceful coexistence, and we talk about concord and, peace and harmony. And I do not know what our strategy should be post the CPC centenary celebration. That is very important. I think, we should look ahead. Yes, a post-mortem is in order, and that is what we are doing at this point of time. But it's also important to understand and read between the lines of whether Xi Jinping will continue to remain the undisputed leader, as he himself, in his own word, as I said, says that the breach in the fortress would come from within the fortress. And there has been a lot of purge. I was just reading on one article by a former ambassador to China, Vijay Gokhale, and who rose to be the foreign secretary. He talked about there's been a lot of purge inside the PLA and the People's Security Forces, etc., Bureau, etc. So it's not as if Xi Jinping is very well ensconced in his sort of throne, and everybody is sort of bowing to his diktat. Despite the fact that he has sort of coronated himself to be a lifelong leader. That there are fissures, and there is also a talk that they need to infuse the red DNA or the red gene into the second rank of leadership, the next generation. In other words, there is a possibility of another Tiananmen Square like upheaval, which he or the top leadership of the CPC envisages in the not so longer future, in the future. So because you see, things are changed. Of course, people talk about Tiananmen Square as being a student revolt, but actually it is because of party factionalism which actually drove the university students to take on the role of rebellion at that point of time. So I would just sort of leave it at that.
Thank you. Yes, Tiananmen Square, when it happened, was one surprise, or rather, it was a very manifestation of the kind of frustration that had been building up, and it's the one very major fact about the Chinese Communist Party is that it not only has made the lives of the Tibetans and the Uyghurs miserable, but they've made the lives of their own people miserable also. There's a tremendous amount of suppression of Chinese people. The Tibetans and Uyghurs have been put into forced labor. They've been they are under re-education programs, and now the latest ploy is to raise military units of Tibetans who are there. It remains to be seen how successful they will be, because the Tibetans there are not a happy lot. There have been 150 odd immolations by Tibetan monks in these, not very many years. General Dwivedi, I will request you to sort of take a look at what all we should be doing militarily to counter or to be prepared for what all China may have in store.
Well, Anil, I think to start with, I think we need to have a very clear long-term China policy. Our China policy is more than hiccups. We react. It is more situation-based, more event-based.
Certainly.
Rather than that, we need to have a very clear long-term China policy. And let's get it straight. China is an adversary, and we have gone wrong in assessing China right from our independence days. Our first prime minister, he had misread Mao absolutely, and we have to pay the 62 price. And thereon also, the Chinese have done everything possible to marginalize India. They have Pakistan as proxy. They have come in big way in South Asia. At international forums, they have always taken an anti-stand. So I think we should have no doubt that China is our adversary and we have to prepare accordingly. Our preparation has to be in different domains. First and foremost is the power differential. The kind of the gap between our comprehensive national power and the Chinese is phenomenal. I think we have to close in this gap, and that is the only way, because Chinese understand only one language, that is strength. In case you are not strong, Chinese will eat you up, because Chinese despise weak. So we have to strengthen our comprehensive national power, and that has to be in the economic domain, in the military domain, political domain, and diplomatic domain. I'll take these very precisely one at a time. Firstly, I think as far as China is concerned, political parties apart, we must have one China stand. Despite no matter which party is there, it has to be one China-centric policy. Secondly, I think economically, we have to close up the gap. We cannot be satisfied with 3 trillion and 14 trillion economy when we compare the two. I think we have to get very serious on economy. Thirdly is our military potential. Right now, we have enough potential to defend ourselves, but we have to build our offensive capability.
Yeah.
You see, in these later incursions, until we occupied Kailash range, Chinese were not budging on the negotiation table. The moment we did that, they softened their stand. So therefore, we have to build enough offensive capability and also prepare for border management because Chinese do not intend to fight a major war. These will be small skirmishes, nibbling here, nibbling there, embarrassing us, keeping us under tension. So we have to have very, very calibrated border management, which should be under the army. All the paramilitary forces, they have to be one joint, you know, command and control. We cannot have 10 type of organizations floating around there. And I myself have seen that on the borders, this is a major problem. We have to modernize, we have to theaterize, we have to create theater command. That is not an option. It has to be done, only it has to be fast tracked. And otherwise, around Indo-Pacific, around Indian Ocean, we have to go in for strong alliances. We have to go formalize Quad. We have to build up good partnership. And I think closer home, we have to reset our neighborhood policy because neighbors like Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Myanmar are very important for us. They are like the shield, like Bhutan. I think we have to reset our policy because right now our neighborhood policy also needs a relook and we have to contain China. And finally, I would say that this is a national call. It is not a call of any ministry or one segment. It's a national call, and we have to take it as a nation and also on the global and regional perspective. We got to reset our complete policies and also our future strategy and plans because China is a adversary, China is a threat, and we have to take it head on. Anil.
There's absolutely no doubt about what you've brought out. They, we have to, there's um, all our deficiencies have we made good. Yes, you brought out, and we discussed this also, that they bullet shy. So they are not probably going to get involved into an actual, firefight in a confrontation, but they have already, what have they done since the Wuhan Institute of Virology came out with what we are all facing today, the pandemic? This is not something which came out of the blue. This is a biological weapon being experimented, which either went awry or was leaked, and to see what the effect would be. And the effect is there on 214 countries and territories. The world's countries are 193. Beyond that are territories. And all of them are contaminated by what we are referring to as COVID-19. This did not come from the Wuhan wet market, because the Wuhan wet market sells a whole lot of animals, but not bats. This was isolated from bats and developed into a biological weapon. We should be very clear about that. There's enough research that has come on it. And there was, in 2015, can you imagine that there were Chinese scientists who were discussing what the weaponization of the SARS would amount to in a country like India? What all kind of effect it will have of, creating such a pressure on the medical system, of putting everything out of gear, not to mention the economy. We, I think, Dr. Shrikant Konapalli, you should, I request you to comment on what all we've been a little too, for 70 years, I've said, and I've repeatedly said that we've taken too much. Do you think so? Please.
Yes, I think when we look at the One China policy, we have agreed to on a platter the Tibet as part of China without seeking reciprocity on Kashmir, on Northeast, or on other areas. So it was a problem that we faced in the beginning, but there is also that argument at that time. Nehru thought that there is a huge asymmetry in power relations because British India left, leaving the British Armada, which was involved in the global wars and also against the Qing dynasty. So the asymmetry he thought of resolving through diplomacy. But when we look at, say, Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, he represents $50 billion GDP, if those figures are correct for their economy. But he brought down Trump, who represents $18 trillion of GDP. There was so much of asymmetry between North Korea and the United States. What really mattered there was the leadership in terms of their prowess. Likewise, the Mao Zedong's army was a ragtag army in 1950. They were basically called millets and rifles armed forces when they entered the Korean War. Of course, the Soviets helped them in modernization. So they were bringing the US generals to the negotiating table on the ceasefire line. So asymmetry did function, but it is the leadership in North Korea and China which resolved the asymmetry. I think in terms of the Indian leadership, the asymmetry functioned in a slightly different manner and to the detriment of India's national interests. So that is where the leadership matters. And that is where, when we stood up in Galwan, things started falling in place.
Thank you. Jaideep, your comments on this, actions from our side.
Yes, I think we should be very cautious about China, especially after what happened last year, because that, despite the fact
I'm now referring to the kinds of issues that we should take up on the table.
yes,
Yes.
yes. I think it's very important to also sort of after all, we are neighbors. I mean, yes, we naturally view, and it is a truism almost, that China is the adversary. There's no question about it, and they are not only nibbling at our territory, but trying to influence, minds in the country also by different resorting to different methods. But if I were to talk about, what are the aspects which actually get the Chinese vote is our novel methods of neighborhood first policy, for instance. Yes, we have not quite got there, but the fact of the matter is, that is something that they feel is a China containment sort of a strategy, which has been sort of propounded by the Prime Minister Narendra Modi. But that is why they try to become very close to Bangladesh, for instance, which is a natural friend and an ally, especially the Awami League government and Sheikh Hasina's dispensation, which is there. I mean, if you take a closer reading at this thing, how they're trying to sort of, act against India by trying to sort of, put representatives in the সংসদ, that is the Bangladesh parliament, who are close to China by all sorts of methods, including buying them out by giving businesses, etc. I don't want to give any names here, but it is quite evident from a closer reading of some of these things that not only the two diesel submarines, I mean, what maritime concerns do Bangladesh have? And I do not know as to why New Delhi allowed this acquisition to happen in the first place. But the fact of the matter is, the Chinese are not very happy with the fact that, we have a friendly neighborhood, we have a neighborhood first policy, and they even trying to sort of, do this with our foremost ally like Bhutan. They're trying to sort of go into a treaty which actually talks about that, the sanctuary, Shektan sanctuary, which basically, would actually eat into the Arunachal Pradesh area, which they call the Southern Tibet. So they are trying to sort of, of course, Sri Lanka, and we know about Hambantota, and we know about how, bad debts have released, etc. But the fact of the matter is, I come back once again to the final point is that where do we go from now onwards? They have completed, the CPC has completed 100 years, and we have seen the writing of the wall. I think they are in the quest for global supremacy, that is without doubt, and that is to oust United States. And they are trying to show, as one had earlier said in such an webinar, some sort of a magnanimity that, we are for peace, we are for concord, we are for, all sorts of magnanimous statements are being made, because that is also a stratagem by which you win over, lesser powers. And they do not think India is an equal partner as far as, power is concerned. So I think, the aspects which we should put on the table is, I think, a definitive move to settle the boundary problem, because Bhutan and India are the only two countries, and I think, there is no question about it. At least in the eastern sector, I would say that at least for the last couple of which I have studied and analyzed, there have been no great incidents after this one wrongdoing incident. So maybe we should be the first ones this time to say, well, you have talked about accord and concord and harmony. Let's call the bluff and say that why don't you convert what is the line of actual control, and all right, as is, where is basis if need be, and make it into an international boundary.
No doubt, no doubt. Gentlemen, I think I will now request you all to make a last round of, very briefly, a roundup of anything that further that you may want to bring out. The very well brought out point so far. General Dwivedi.
Well, Anil, I think in concluding comments, I would only make 3-4 interventions. First and foremost, I think we got to take China very seriously. It cannot be laissez-faire style of dealing with China. We have to have a very concrete and a far-reaching policy. And secondly, we got to get into competition, because Chinese are right now, they have an advantage vis-a-vis us. Whether you take comprehensive national path, militarily, I think we need to have a clear policy how we are going to reduce this power differential. And thirdly, I think economically we got to really kick up fast and ensure that the economic imbalance is not there. And lastly, I think we got to have a more aggressive diplomatic policy. We should not be doing a half-hearted step like Quad. We really don't want it to be an alliance. We just want it to be a coalition. We are very, very skeptical. I think we need to shed off this China phobia. Stop thinking what they will think. Let's take our interest in forbearing interest rather than always saying what will China think. Let them think what they want to think. It's our prerogative to think for ourselves, and let's not be too much paranoid. And especially our political diplomatic community, we need to be more forthright. I think army has well gotten over the 62 rivers, and we are giving Chinese run for the money. But I think that policy must stand. India need to stand up and tell China very clearly two things. Firstly, hegemony against us will not work. We will deal with you as equal partners. And secondly, if you want to settle border issue, it will not be on your terms, it will be on mutual terms. And we will ensure that we don't get out bargained. I think at the end of it, I'll only say one simple sentence. We need to understand Chinese well, understand their psyche well, and think how the Chinese think and not how we think about China. That is what will actually make the difference. And Chinese two words are very important, Li and Luan. Li is strength and Luan is chaos. And you rightly brought out Chinese externally are very formidable, but internally they are very fragile. And we must exploit their internal vulnerability and match up their external strength. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Shrikant Konapalli, please.
I think in conclusion, I would like to suggest India needs to strengthen its conventional and nuclear deterrence capabilities, number one. Number two, it has to expand the infrastructure projects in the border areas, combining with small and medium enterprises so that the border populated areas will benefit out of these infrastructure projects. And we create stakes among the border regions, number two. Number three, we also need to have the quadrilateral security dialogue process going. And that is as an insurance for any problem that we face from China.
Jaideep?
So I just want to echo what General Dwivedi said about our diplomacy. You know, the world has been naming the Chinese diplomacy as wolf warrior diplomacy and coercive diplomacy. And I can't see for the life of me as to why some of my friends have been on finest diplomats, Indian diplomats. So I think we also need to sort of, if it is a lesson to be learned from whoever, that is not an issue, but we also need to be, coercive, not in a sense of belligerence, but yes, when it comes to, calling a spade, I think we also need to exercise that option if necessary. And in the end, I would like to also simply say that, talking about Xi Jinping's speech and, the way he was at one point of time spewing fire and brimstone, the dragon, as I never fail to repeat, is a mythical animal which we read about in fables and tales, and something which is past and dead and gone. And here in India, we epitomize the elephant, which is living, thriving.
The elephant and the lion,
And
both
in Guwahati, from where I'm speaking, is not too far
very
away.
majestic animals, yes.
It's romping around. If tomorrow koi takka lege, to fir, they'll have to understand that they are not abound against a wall of steel as Xi Jinping stays, but against a formidable force of elephants and pachyderms. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Jaideep. I thank you all, gentlemen, for a very, very, I think, well-rounded, look at China. And I will end here by paying very deep tributes to those Indian soldiers who laid down their lives last year, and to those who went and avenged them, because they have taught us, and we must follow that example on the table in our dealings, that don't take us lightly. You've gobbled Tibet, you've gobbled Mongolia. You don't try and nibble at us anymore. Let's come out. Let's put all the cards on the table and let's take you on. We got to stop being coy. You got to stop being, very hesitant about what is rightfully ours. Well, only we can do it. We, of course, are the Becca Quad, very good. We must get into, but the most important thing is that we have to be strong ourselves. We have to be very strong militarily and alongside politico-diplomatically also. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, my co-panelist, and thank you, Anil.